Lecture 11 is the last of the lecture materials for week 9. And what I want to talk about in this mini lecture is the use of Stata to expand the amount of documentation that we have on our data. And to create the documentation I want to talk about today, which are called codebooks, we need to talk about two pieces of information. Metadata about our data sets and metadata about our variables. When I talk about metadata, what I mean is literally data about data. So it is higher level information that summarizes the contents of a data set, in this case, or summarizes the contents of a variable, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And Stata gives us a number of tools to attach metadata directly into our Stata dataset files. One way we can do that is with dataset labels. When you open up a Stata dataset file, the .dta files that are automatically created by our template for the class, this little label is shown to immediately remind users what it is that the dataset represents. Those are called, again, dataset labels. We can also attach notes to our dataset. So we can use notes to store information about dataset sources, what they represent, when they were initially downloaded, and how they've been modified. All great pieces of information to make sure that we have about our data, and also to include in a codebook, which we'll generate in just a couple of minutes. In Stata, we can use the label data command with our label text wrapped in double quotes. So we need both an initial double quote, and then after our label text, we need a second double quote. And that will apply our data label to the data set. It's worth knowing that dataset labels have a limited length, so we need to keep them short but descriptive. To add more detail to our metadata about the dataset itself, we can use notes. To add a note, we write the notes command, and then an underscore DTA with a colon, and then we can start entering the text of our note. You do not need to wrap the text of the note in double quotes. Keep that in mind. This process of appending notes to our dataset will always be the same. The notes command and the underscore DTA with a colon will never change. We can add additional notes about the data as well. So I'll add a note about what the observational unit is. Note that they're census tracts. We can add a note about when the data were downloaded in case data change. That can be important information. You can also add a note about what table it came from, right? This can be helpful if we need to go back and access the data again later on. And finally, we can add some notes about what modifications we've made to the data set. So we'll note here that we've deleted all of the variables except for total units, which refers to the total number of vacant housing units in a given census tract. Just as we added metadata to our dataset, we can also add metadata to our variables themselves. This can take on a couple of different forms. The first form I want to talk about are what we call variable labels. And variable labels are immediately visible in Stata's user interface. They'll show up in the upper right-hand corner where you'll see a list of variables. In the dataset, you'll also see those variable labels. And so we want to make sure these labels are short and show up in just a few characters, but more descriptive than our variable names. So for example, for the variable GOID, a good variable label might be tract ID number. It gives just a little bit more description without taking up too much space. Another type of metadata we can associate with individual variables are variable notes. These work exactly the same way that dataset notes work, except for instead of specifying that underscore DTA, we put a variable name in its place. So this is an example note we could attach to the GeoID variable in Stata. When we look at variable metadata, we can start by looking at what we have currently for variable labels. And the easiest way to do that is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Under the variables list, you can see both the variable names and the variable labels themselves. We can also get a sense of what those variable labels look like if we use the describe commands. Now, describe commands will list out both the variable names themselves, but also the variable labels. So we can see the variable GeoID has a label of GeoID2, and total units has a label of D001. If we want to change those variable labels, we can use the label variable command, followed by the variable name, and then a new label wrapped in double quotes. So I could pick a label, something like tracked ID numbers. And now we've changed that label. We can do the same for the total units variable. Make reference to vacant housing, for example. And we can see, if we use the describe command again, our newly applied variable labels. We can also add notes to our variables. And so to do that, we're going to use the notes command, followed by our variable name and a colon. I'll add a note about the data the variable contains. Reference that it contains numeric versions of these tracked ID numbers, since you may also have a string version of these data. You can also add a second note. Again, same process. And we can talk about how the data may have been modified, when they were modified, who they were modified by. This is all part of what should be meticulous record keeping that we have on how our data set is being changed. We can use notes also to display our notes. So type notes and then the variable name, and we'll get a readout of what those notes look like. The final thing that I want to talk about today are codebooks. Codebooks are documents that detail typically a list of every variable a dataset contains. They will give at least examples of the types of values that each variable has, some information about the storage structure as a string or numeric data. And Stata makes it really easy to take the metadata that we've just created, both for the dataset and for variables, and combine them into a single coherent text document. So I want to walk through that process with you right now. That process involves 3 commands. We want to start a log file specifically for the codebook itself, separate from the other log files we've created. We then want to run the codebook command with 2 options, header and notes. This will give us kind of the most information possible about each of our variables. And then we're going to go ahead and close that log. You notice we use quietly on both log commands, and that is to suppress the output that the log command itself normally generates. It's best to run these as a group, right next to each other, all 3 commands right in your do file. So what I have here is a do file. That is what we would call a minimal working example. So it has only the minimal amount of code we need to create a codebook. So this is less than what you would do for a fully annotated do file, but it will produce a codebook for us. I want to point out the 3 forward slashes that you see on line 6 there. Those forward slashes are instructions to Stata to include everything on line 7 as part of the command on line 6. So this is a technique for making our do files more readable by ensuring that all of our command is compact and fits within the 80 character wide document that we want to generate. So So we can run this do file now. We'll go up and click on the do button, and that will create our codebook for us. If I switch to Stata's main window, you can see what the contents of that codebook would look like. Our dataset label, our dataset notes are all there, as are details about the GeoID variable, including the notes that we added. And these have been saved in our outputs folder as a text file that we can easily upload to GitHub as part of our project documentation.